The cargo ship Magellan Star cut through the gray Atlantic swell, its hull groaning with the weight of 1,000 containers stacked high above the deck. Sofia Larsen stood at the port railing, watching the horizon dissolve into a haze of mist and salt spray, the cold wind pulling strands of hair from beneath her wool cap. She had been aboard for 6 months, long enough to know every vibration of the engines, every creak of the bulkheads, the rhythm of life in this floating steel town. But something had been wrong for the past 3 days. The ship's official manifest listed industrial machinery bound for Rotterdam, yet the Plimsoll line sat dangerously low, indicating a far heavier load. She had mentioned it to Captain Villani over dinner, expecting his usual dismissive wave. Instead, his face had gone still, and he had changed the subject abruptly, his fork hovering over his plate as if he had forgotten how to eat. That was 2 nights ago. Now the captain was dead, found slumped over his charts by the first mate. The ship's doctor called it a heart attack, but Sofia had seen the bruise on the back of Villani's skull before they covered him with a sheet, an ugly, mottled impression that looked nothing like an accident. She said nothing, but her mind began cataloging details with the precision of a woman who had learned long ago that survival depended on noticing what others chose to ignore. 2 extra men on board who did not appear on any crew list, the sealed containers in hold 3 that the regular crew were forbidden to approach, and now the sudden silence from the radio room after she had tried to send a routine position report. The storm forecast for the region was worsening, but Sofia sensed a different kind of tempest building beneath the decks, one that had already claimed one life and would not hesitate to claim more. The acting captain was now a man named Gregor Sokolov, a senior officer who had joined the ship only a week before departure. Sofia had noted his arrival but thought little of it. Crew changes were common, and he had presented himself with the easy confidence of a seasoned sailor. Now she watched him from the corner of her eye as he addressed the crew in the mess hall, his voice calm but carrying an edge that had not been there before, a thinness beneath the surface that made her skin prickle. He told them the captain's death was a tragic accident, that they would continue to Rotterdam as planned, and that the approaching hurricane was nothing to worry about, a routine weather system that would pass to the north. He then announced that all communications would be restricted to essential navigation traffic only, to conserve power for the upcoming storm. Sofia knew that was a lie. The Magellan Star had 2 independent generators and a satellite uplink with enough reserve capacity to broadcast for weeks. When she returned to the radio room, she found the satellite terminal disabled, not broken, but deliberately disconnected, the cables pulled cleanly from their ports and the access panel left slightly ajar. She reconnected them, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, but the system refused to authenticate. Someone had changed the access codes. She sat in the dim glow of the console, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and realized she was trapped. The ship was now a closed circuit, isolated from the outside world, and somewhere in the holds below lay a secret worth killing for. She thought of the novice deckhand, Mira, a young woman who had confided in her weeks ago about strange sounds coming from hold 3 at night, a rhythmic clanking that did not match the normal shifting of cargo. Sofia decided she needed an ally, and quickly. Sofia found Mira in the chain locker, a cramped space at the bow where the anchor chains coiled like sleeping serpents. The young woman was pretending to inspect mooring lines that did not need inspection, her hands trembling as she worked the stiff fibers. When she saw Sofia, she let the rope fall and pressed herself against the bulkhead, her eyes wide in the weak light of a single bulb. "You know about the captain," Mira whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant thrum of the engines. "I saw you looking at his head when they brought him out." "You saw what I saw." Sofia nodded and closed the heavy steel door behind them, sealing them in the narrow space. "I also know the satellite uplink has been locked out. Someone on this ship does not want us calling for help." Myra's face went pale, her freckles standing out against the sudden whiteness of her skin. "It's the containers. The ones in hold 3. A few nights ago, I saw Gregor and the 2 other men opening one. They were loading something inside, moving crates with the kind of care you only use for things that break or explode. I couldn't see what, but they had military-grade seals on the container, not our usual cargo locks. Sofia's pulse quickened, a cold certainty settling in her chest. She asked Mira if she remembered any details, markings, numbers, anything. Mira shook her head but said she had taken a photograph with her phone before they noticed her and she fled, dropping the phone twice as she ran. She still had the phone hidden in her bunk, buried under her spare clothes. Sofia told her to retrieve it and meet her at the bow in 10 minutes, away from the cameras that dotted the main corridors. As Sofia left the locker, she passed the ship's bosun, who gave her a long, unreadable look, his eyes lingering on her face. She realized she did not know who among the crew could be trusted anymore. The storm on the weather charts was still 2 days out, but the storm inside the ship was already upon them, and it moved faster than any hurricane. Myra's photograph, when Sofia examined it on the small screen beneath the cover of a tarpaulin at the bow, showed a corner of a container with a serial number partially visible and a logo she did not recognize, a stylized eagle and a number she filed away in her memory. The men in the image, Gregor and the 2 strangers, were handling long, rectangular crates wrapped in black plastic, the kind of packaging she had seen in documentary footage about conflict zones. Sofia zoomed in with her thumb and forefinger, expanding the image until it became pixelated, and saw the unmistakable outline of weapon stockpiles, the shape of rifle barrels, the square boxes of ammunition, the longer cylinders that looked like missile components. Her stomach turned, a wave of nausea that she forced down with a slow breath. The Magellan Star was not carrying industrial machinery, it was transporting arms, and the sealed containers likely held enough firepower to equip a small army. She deleted the photo from Myra's phone after transferring it to her own encrypted folder, then told Mira to act as though nothing had changed, to go about her duties with the same tired routine as always. They needed to restore communications before Gregor decided to eliminate any witnesses. Sofia's plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. The ship's emergency distress beacon was located on the bridge wing, accessible only with a key held by the captain. Captain Villani's keys had been taken by Gregor immediately after the body was discovered, but Sofia knew of a spare in the captain's quarters, hidden behind a loose panel in his private bathroom, a secret Villani had drunkenly confided to her one night when the loneliness of the sea had loosened his tongue. She would retrieve it that night, activate the beacon, and hope that any passing vessel or coastal station would detect the signal before the hurricane made rescue impossible. But first, she had to get past the locked door to the captain's quarters, which Gregor had sealed with a heavy padlock after the death, as though the room itself held secrets that could not be allowed to escape. The corridors of the Magellan Star were quiet during the midnight watch, when only a skeleton crew manned the bridge and engine room. The ship's fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a reddish glow to preserve night vision, casting long shadows that stretched and shrank with the ship's gentle roll. Sofia moved through them with practiced silence, her rubber-soled boots making no sound on the steel deck. She reached the captain's quarters and found the door secured with a padlock that had not been there before, a heavy brass unit that gleamed dully in the emergency lighting. She had anticipated this. She carried a small kit of tools she had borrowed from the engineering workshop, wrapped in a cloth to prevent rattling. The lock was a standard marine model, and after 90 seconds of patient work, feeling the tumblers click beneath her tension wrench, it opened with a soft metallic sigh. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and Villani's pipe tobacco, the scent so familiar it almost brought tears to her eyes. Sofia worked quickly, sliding the bathroom panel aside with her fingertips, her heart pounding in her ears. The spare key was taped to the back of a loose tile, exactly where the captain had once confided. She pocketed the key, its weight a small anchor of hope, and was about to leave when she heard footsteps in the corridor, 2 sets, moving with purpose. She pressed herself into the narrow space between the bed and the wardrobe, her breath held, her body rigid. The door creaked open. Gregor's voice came low and angry, "Search everything. If she knows anything, we move tonight." Sofia held her breath as 2 sets of boots entered the room. Papers were shuffled, drawers opened with impatient hands. She watched through a crack in the wardrobe door as one of the strangers, the taller of the 2, with a scar across his jaw, pulled open the bathroom panel and peered inside. He found nothing. After what felt like an eternity of silence and terror, they left, the door clicking shut behind them. Sofia waited 5 more minutes, counting her heartbeats, before slipping out, the key cold and heavy in her palm, her legs trembling with the aftermath of fear. Sofia did not go directly to the bridge. She first found Mira in the galley, where the young deckhand was pretending to make tea, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Sofia whispered her success and told Mira to meet her at the emergency beacon in 1 hour, when the watch change would create a gap in patrols. Then she made her way down 3 decks to the engine room to find the chief engineer, a grizzled man named Olaf who had served on the ship for 20 years. She trusted him because he had openly argued with Gregor about the generator settings the day before, accusing the acting captain of endangering the ship by diverting power from the cooling systems. Olaf was alone in his workshop, a cramped space filled with spare parts and the smell of lubricating oil, a mug of coffee growing cold beside him on the workbench. Sofia closed the door and told him everything: the altered manifest, the locked hold, the satellite codes changed without authorization, and the bruise on the captain's skull that no one else seemed willing to see. Olaf listened without interrupting, his face hardening with each word, his thick fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the metal bench. When she finished, he nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I wondered why the fuel consumption was too high for the manifest weight," he said. "I ran the numbers twice yesterday, thinking my instruments were faulty. We're carrying double what the papers say, maybe more." He agreed to help by creating a distraction, a minor engine alarm that would pull Gregor and his men to the machinery spaces while Sofia activated the beacon. They set the plan in motion for 0200 hours, when the night watch would be at its most sluggish and the corridor cameras would be cycling through their blind spots. Sofia left the engine room with a renewed sense of purpose, though the weight of what she carried pressed against her chest like an extra anchor. At 0200, the engine alarm blared, a sharp klaxon that cut through the sleeping ship, echoing off the steel walls and sending vibrations through the deck plates. Sofia heard boots pounding on the decks above as Gregor and his men rushed toward the engine room, their voices sharp with urgency. She moved quickly to the bridge wing, Mira close behind her, their shadows merging in the dim red light. The emergency beacon was housed in a reinforced casing bolted to the exterior bulkhead, its activation keyhole covered by a weatherproof cap that had been painted over so many times it was hard to pry open. Sofia inserted Villani's key and turned it with a steady hand. A red indicator light began to flash, signaling that the beacon was transmitting the ship's position and identity to satellites overhead. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, the cold air filling her lungs with the taste of salt and relief. Then the light went dead. She turned the key again, nothing, not even a flicker. Mira pointed to the side of the casing, where a set of wires had been cleanly severed with what looked like a precision cutter. Someone had disabled the beacon before she even got there, perhaps days ago. They heard footsteps behind them, heavy and deliberate. Sofia spun around to find Gregor standing at the bridge entrance, flanked by the 2 strangers. In his hand was a heavy-duty flashlight, its metal casing catching the dim red glow of the bridge instruments. "You should not have done that," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. "Now we have a problem." Mira stepped in front of Sofia, her voice shaking but defiant. "The signal already went out. They know we're here." Gregor smiled, a thin, cold expression. "The beacon was offline before you ever touched it. You've been running in circles, ladies." He motioned to his men, who stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this before. Sofia's mind raced. She had one card left to play, and she would have to play it now. Sofia raised her hands as if in surrender, her palms facing outward, but her mind was already calculating angles and distances. She had noticed earlier that the bridge's navigation computer was connected to a secondary satellite terminal used for weather updates and maritime safety alerts. That terminal had its own independent transmitter, one that Gregor might have overlooked because it was rarely used and had no obvious connection to the main communications array. As the two men advanced, she shouted to Mira, "The weather terminal, now!" Mira dove for the console, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the speed of desperation. Gregor lunged, but Sofia threw herself in his path, grabbing the heavy flashlight and shoving him off balance with a burst of adrenaline she had not known she possessed. The two men pulled her away, one of them gripping her arms from behind, but Mira had already triggered the terminal. A green light blinked on the console, indicating a transmission in progress, a burst transmission that would take only seconds to complete. Gregor shoved Sofia aside and struck Mira across the face with the back of his hand, sending her to the deck, her cheek splitting open against the edge of a console. But the damage was done. The weather terminal had sent a pre-written distress message Sofia had composed earlier that evening, along with the incriminating photograph and a summary of her findings, addressed to the maritime authorities in Iceland and Norway. Gregor stared at the screen, his face drained of color, his confidence crumbling. He turned to his men. "We have to get to the lifeboats. Now!" One of them protested, gesturing at the containers below, but Gregor cut him off. "In 3 hours, there will be helicopters here. We need to be gone before they arrive, or we're finished." Gregor and his men rushed off the bridge, their boots clattering down the metal stairs toward the lifeboats stored on the deck below. Sofia helped Mira to her feet, her cheek already swelling, a thin line of blood tracing her jaw, but her eyes were clear and fierce. "They're leaving," Mira said, wincing. "But they won't destroy the evidence. The containers are still in the hold." Sofia nodded, already moving toward the intercom. They needed to secure the ship and ensure that when help arrived, the cargo could not be moved or hidden. She used the bridge intercom to contact Olaf in the engine room, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The chief engineer had heard the commotion and was already on his way up, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Together, the three of them locked the bridge and raced down the internal stairwells, bypassing the main deck where Gregor's crew was preparing the lifeboat. They reached the cargo control room, a small space adjacent to hold 3, filled with monitors and control panels. Olaf used his master override codes, which Gregor had not thought to change, to engage the emergency locks on all container clamps, freezing the entire cargo load in place. The system required a 12-hour reset that only the chief engineer could reverse, and it would take heavy machinery to bypass. As the locks engaged with a series of metallic clunks, they heard the sound of the lifeboat hitting the water, a distant splash followed by the roar of an outboard engine. Sofia climbed to the main deck in time to see the small boat bobbing on the dark swells, its navigation light a tiny star disappearing into the night. She stood in the cold wind, watching them flee, her hands gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. Dawn broke over a calmer sea, though the distant clouds on the horizon still promised the hurricane's eventual arrival, a dark bruise spreading across the sky. Sofia, Mira, and Olaf gathered the remaining crew in the mess hall, 9 other sailors who had been kept in the dark about the cargo and the captain's murder. Some of them had been sleeping through the night's events, others had heard the commotion but stayed in their quarters out of fear. Sofia explained everything: the arms hidden in Hold 3, the captain's murder, Gregor's flight. She showed them the photograph, the logs, the severed beacon wires. Some of the crew were skeptical until Olaf confirmed the fuel consumption anomalies and showed them the sealed containers on the cargo monitors, rows of steel boxes that had no business on a vessel carrying industrial machinery. The crew voted to wait for rescue rather than attempt to sail the ship without a captain or navigation officer. Sofia returned to the bridge and used the weather terminal again, this time to send a full report to the nearest Coast Guard, including GPS coordinates, the serial numbers from the containers, and descriptions of the 3 fugitives. The response came within the hour. A maritime patrol aircraft would overfly the ship by midday, and a naval vessel was en route to take control of the cargo and transport the crew to safety. The hurricane had shifted course slightly, but it would still reach them in 36 hours, enough time, the Coast Guard assured, for the naval ship to arrive. Sofia felt exhaustion settle into her bones, but she could not rest. Not yet. She needed to see Hold 3 for herself, to understand the full scale of what she had uncovered. With Olaf's help, Sofia opened the sealed entrance to Hold 3. The air inside was cold and heavy, smelling of diesel and metal and something else, the faint chemical scent of fresh lubricant. Rows of identical containers stretched into the dim light, their surfaces marked with serial numbers that matched the photograph. Olaf used the crane controls to open one of them, the hydraulic system groaning as the steel doors swung apart. The container was packed with wooden crates, each stamped with the same stylized eagle logo. When he pried one open with a crowbar, they found rows of assault rifles packed in foam, alongside ammunition cases and what appeared to be components for guided missiles. Sofia stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. This was not a small smuggling operation, it was a major trafficking network moving weaponry worth millions, enough to arm a militia or destabilize a region. She photographed everything, documenting each serial number and container seal, working methodically despite the tremor in her hands. By the time she finished, the sound of aircraft engines echoed overhead. She climbed to the bridge wing and saw a Coast Guard plane circling low, its wings glinting in the pale sunlight, the white and orange fuselage a welcome sight against the gray sky. The crew gathered on deck, waving, some of them weeping with relief. For the first time in days, Sofia allowed herself to feel something other than fear. The naval vessel arrived 12 hours later, cutting through the rising swells just as the first winds of the hurricane began to whip the sea into whitecaps. The crew was evacuated by helicopter in a swift, efficient operation, and the Magellan Star was secured under armed guard, its deadly cargo waiting for the investigators who would arrive once the storm passed. The naval ship transported the crew of the Magellan Star to a port in Iceland, where they were met by international investigators and the press. Sofia spent 3 days in a quiet hotel room in Reykjavik, giving statements, turning over all her evidence, the photograph, the videos from Hold 3, the fuel consumption logs, and the records of the disabled satellite terminal. Investigators from 3 countries interviewed her, each time asking the same questions in slightly different ways, testing her memory for details she had already recited a dozen times. The investigators confirmed that Gregor Sokolov and his 2 accomplices had been picked up from their lifeboat by a fishing trawler off the Faroe Islands, but they were later apprehended at an airport in Norway when Sofia's description of them was circulated through Interpol. The arms shipment was traced to a network of dealers operating across 3 continents, and the information Sofia had provided led to several arrests in Europe and the Middle East. The crew of the Magellan Star were commended for their bravery, though Sofia felt no sense of heroism. She thought of Captain Villani, a decent man killed because he had noticed what she had noticed. She thought of the weight of silence, of the choices people make when they see something wrong and decide to look away. In the quiet of her hotel room, With the northern lights flickering green and violet beyond her window, she wrote a full account of what had happened, not for the investigators, but for herself, to remember that even in the middle of the ocean, with no one watching, one person's refusal to look away could change everything. 6 months later, Sofia Larsen stood on the dock of a small harbor in northern Scotland, watching a cargo ship being unloaded under the grey winter sky. She was no longer a crew member. She had accepted a position as a maritime safety inspector, a role that allowed her to travel the world's shipping lanes, checking manifests and cargo holds for the kind of discrepancies she had once discovered by accident. The trial of Gregor Sokolov and his co-conspirators had concluded the previous week. All three were convicted of murder, arms trafficking, and conspiracy, receiving sentences that would keep them behind bars for decades. The masterminds behind the network were still being pursued by international authorities, but the operation that had used the Magellan Star as its vessel was dismantled, its shipping routes exposed, its clients identified. Mira had returned to her family in Ireland, her face healed except for a thin scar along her jaw that she wore without self-consciousness. She had sent Sofia a letter thanking her for trusting her that night in the chain locker, and they still exchanged messages every few weeks. Olaf had retired to a small cottage on the Norwegian coast, though he sent Sofia a postcard every month, usually a picture of some improbably peaceful fjord, sometimes with a sardonic caption about how much quieter his life was without her alarms. Sofia often thought of the Magellan Star, of the night she had stood on the bridge wing watching the lifeboat vanish into the darkness. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. As the new ship before her began to load its cargo, she checked her clipboard and walked toward the gangway, ready to do what she had always done: pay attention, ask questions, and refuse to let the silence win. The wind off the harbor was cold, but she had faced worse, and she knew that somewhere out on the water, there would always be another ship, another manifest, another chance to make sure the truth did not sink beneath the waves.